Here's the generalized syntax for creating an inline function. So it's a create function, returns a table, and you have a body of it. So the important thing about an inline function is that you can only have a single select statement. So the way to do this is have the return statement, and then within that, optionally within parentheses, include the select statement. And then you have the with option here, where you can specify the different function definition options. So you can encrypt it, and you can do various things within the definition. Now, note that there's no place to write code or declare variables with an inline function. You just get that single select statement. Everything is within that select statement that's contained within the return statement. As I mentioned, this does allow the same function options as scalar functions. Here's an example of a simple inline function. A couple important things about this definition. So it uses the create function, just like you create any user-defined function, but an inline function is always going to return a table. So you specify returns table to indicate the data type returned by this function. And then you have a return statement as the body, which contains a select statement that generates the data. So in fact, this is all a single line of code. And that's what you're limited to for an inline function. So what this code does is it computes some statistics from the order details table and takes advantage of the fact that a select statement, the column list, can contain scalar functions. So I'm selecting and returning the value returned by the product sold user-defined function. That's returned in the units sold column. Calculating the sum of the unit price times quantity, so that's the total sales, taking the average of all the unit prices, and then counting the number of line items. All right, and all of that's coming from the order details table. So I'll go ahead and execute this code to create the function. And it would actually help for me to switch over to the Northwind database. Execute that again. Okay, so now we have the function created in the right database. Now we need to look at executing the inline function. Executing an inline function is a bit tricky. You might be tempted to use syntax like this, because this works for scalar functions, so it must work for inline functions too, right? Well, as you can probably guess from the red squiggly line, when I try to execute this, I get an error message. And what it says is, cannot find either column DBO or the user-defined function or aggregate product statistics, or the name is ambiguous. So this is one of those times where the error message really isn't of too much use unless you really understand what's going on here. The big clue should probably be this part, cannot find column DBO. So that's a big red flag because, well, DBO is a schema name and DBO schema exists in all databases. So, but what the problem is that it's trying to treat DBO as a column. So I'm using this in the wrong way within a select statement. What you have after the select keyword in a select statement needs to be a list of fields or constant types or scalar functions or whatever, single values that are returned for each row that's returned by the select statement. This returns a table. So this is sort of like saying select customers, where the customers is a table. You can't do that. Instead, what you need to do is you need to treat it like a table because that's what's being returned. And you use it within the from clause. So now it's treating it as a table, and I can select star, select the different fields, whatever is appropriate for what I want to get from this user-defined function. So now when I execute this statement, I now get that single row of multiple data values. In other words, the data that is defined by this select statement. All right, so that's select star. You can also explicitly, just like when you select from a table, you can explicitly name all of the columns that you want returned. And you don't have to include all of them. Just like when you're selecting from a table, you can select a subset as well. And so that returns the same results. All right, like scalar functions, inline functions can accept parameters as well. And here's an example of that. Now, it's often still going to make sense to assign a default value to the parameter. Even though, remember, you can't include any code to test for a null value. Because within the body of this inline function, you can only include a single select statement. So there's ways to do kind of inline testing for null values, but you can't use an if construct and have multiple statements whether or not that value is null. So null handling within inline functions can be a little bit tricky. Okay, so product ID, the default value is null. It's an int. So this is going to calculate statistics by product. So it'll do a select. It'll get the number of products sold by product. So again, this is a scalar function. Calculate the sum, calculate the count, and filter on that product ID, whether it's null or a valid value. Okay, so I'll go ahead and create that function. And then we can look at executing it. So, as with scalar user-defined functions, when you call an inline function, it requires that you supply either a value or the default keyword. You can't just call it with empty parentheses if you've defined a parameter. Okay, so this is one way you specify a particular product ID. And so now that's all the statistics for that specific product ID. Or I can use either of these statements in order to use the null value. Again, if I don't know the particulars of how the function is defined, I won't know that default is null unless I look at the source code. But in essence, in effect, these are both doing the same things. And as you can see, I get the same results. Now, a kind of surprising feature of inline functions is that you can update data using them. Well, given their similarity to views, this really probably shouldn't be surprising. But to update data through a function, just as a programmer that's used various programming languages, just always feels a little bit funky. But it actually can be a very cool and useful feature in some kinds of scenarios. Now, the rules for updating data through inline functions are the same as for views. In other words, you won't be able to update computed columns or columns from more than one table if you have an inline function where the select statement uses a join. But nonetheless, inline functions can be updatable, even if they have input parameters. So here's an example of this. So I'm getting product by ID, or defining a function called product by ID, passing in a product ID value. Notice there's no default value this time. And then using a select statement to get information from the products table, and filtering both on the product ID as well as on the discontinued flag. So we want all products that are currently actively being manufactured and sold. All right, so I'll create this function. And then use this code in order to test the function. So when I pass in a value of 3 for the product ID, I can see that's aniseed syrup, unit price is 10, and there's 13 units in stock. All right, it's always good to test your function before you try to do anything else fancier. Okay, so it comes time where we need to update the units in stock for product ID 3. So you can use this kind of code in order to update that data. So what in essence it's doing is it's getting the return value of this user-defined function, which is a table, which in this case is a single row of data. And then it's using that data in order to set units in stock to 63. It's currently 13. And then what the user-defined function is doing is, because it sees that you're updating that data that came from a table, it complies with all the rules for updating data through views, same as the rules for inline functions. It updates the data because it knows where the data was coming from. So I'll go ahead and execute that. And then I will execute this statement to show that the units in stock for aniseed syrup is now 63 units.